In today's video, we're covering Chapter 9, Shaping Behavior. Now, shaping is kind of conceptually similar to things like natural selection, just in a different time frame. So let me explain what I mean. With natural selection, we have external or environmental forces deciding which traits do well in a particular environment, and those traits that benefit fitness being passed on to future generations so they become more and more common. So the common example to talk about natural selection would be Darwin and his finches, where each of these islands had different selective pressures, which led to these finches evolving different sizes and shapes of beaks that allowed the birds to succeed doing different tasks. Artificial selection does basically the same thing, but this time it's humans and selective breeding that is going to be dictating which direction that selection takes. So here we have some fun examples of how we went from normal rock doves or pigeons to all the different weird kinds of breeds that you can get in terms of pigeons. If you want to spend some time on YouTube wasting time and laughing, maybe look up things like rolling pigeons, because people have bred pigeons not only to look fabulous like some of these guys, they've also bred them for particular traits that they thought were desirable. And for whatever reason, enough people thought that pigeons that roll was desirable, and now there's a whole community around breeding them. The more you know. But again, this process is involving selecting which traits are desirable, which ones we want more of, and then mating individuals that have those traits so that those traits become more common in the future. When we talk about shaping, we're basically talking about a very similar idea where we are changing and selecting for different behaviors that fit in whatever environment we're in at the time. So instead of selection, either natural or artificial, that's taking place over multiple generations, when we're looking at behavior, it's a single individual, but the same principles apply. So let's look at selection as a causal process for behaviors. So imagine that you are learning how to turn a doorknob for the first time. When you're doing it, you want to try different behaviors to figure out the optimal way to turn this type of door or doorknob. So maybe you're faced by a type of handle that you've never seen before, and you're not quite sure what to do. So maybe you're going to try different amounts of pressure. You're going to push really, or squeeze it really hard or not very hard. Apply different amounts of strength. Technique: do you turn it left or do you turn it right? Do you turn it at all? Where is your hand? What position is it in? All of these things could be things that you try. And each time you try to open that door, each time you use that handle, you could vary your behavior ever so slightly to see if it gives you a better or a worse result. Those results that are better, you're going to repeat those techniques more often, and those that are worse, you're going to stop trying. So those variations are selected for based on what we encounter in our environment, basically our success or failure in opening that door. So our behavior is then changed or shaped by the experiences with our environment. So we can think of shaping as behavioral selection, kind of like natural and artificial selection, but just on a different scale. So let's get that formal definition of shaping. We can call shaping a differential reinforcement of successive approximations of a target behavior. That is a mouthful. So let's break it down. When we talk about differential reinforcement, that just means that some actions are going to be reinforced and other actions are not. So we're going to reinforce the good ones and not reinforce the bad or undesirable ones. And we can decide what's going to be good or not based on the situation. When we talk about successive approximations, we're basically taking baby steps to try and get us towards a final behavior, that target behavior. And the important part to note is actually the second point here that says that a target behavior is a behavior that the person typically does not exhibit at this point in time. So shaping is only for learning something that you don't know how to do right now, or that you don't do in your natural repertoire of behaviors. So we have this example here of a rat pressing a lever. In all of our earlier chapters, especially talk about reinforcement, we've talked about rats pressing levers or pigeons pecking keys, but we never really acknowledged the fact that those are very unnatural behaviors. It's very weird that those animals do those behaviors. And so to get them to do those behaviors, we'd go through this shaping process. So we start as our target behavior. Well, rats don't press levers in everyday life. That's not something that they do naturally. So we're going to try and get them to press a lever by differentially reinforcing things that are close to lever pressing until they can finally press that lever. So let's walk through the example. Step 1 is when the rat is in that operant box, maybe you reinforce them for being on the right side of the cage. If they're on the side of the cage where the lever is, you're going to give them food. Then when they spend a lot of time on that side of the cage, they know that that's the right side of the cage to be on. You stop reinforcing just being on that side of the cage, and now you reinforce when they get even closer to the lever, maybe until they sniff that lever, and then you reinforce them. So we've changed our reward contingencies, or our reinforcement contingencies, so our differential reinforcement is changing to push them now to sniff the lever before they get some kind of reinforcement. Next, we stop reinforcing the sniffing and we reinforce only when they touch the lever with their paw. And then when they're doing that consistently, you stop reinforcing touching it with your paw and only reinforce them when they fully press the lever. So we have successive approximations, basically baby steps that are getting us closer and closer to them pressing that lever, and we're going to differentially reinforce them so that they only get reinforcement when they do the task they're supposed to be doing, and not when they're doing any previously reinforced tasks after we've moved on from that stage. So we can talk about these kinds of steps multiple times, multiple ways, but the basic guidelines are going to be step 1 is define your target behavior. You want to make sure that you're picking a behavior that the organism can do, and that it's something that they're not doing currently, which kind of ties into our next step, which is determine whether shaping is the most appropriate procedure. If the organism already does that behavior, so maybe you have a very busy rat who happens to touch all over the cage and occasionally presses the lever just on their own. You wouldn't then have to shape the lever pressing behavior. What you could do instead is just use differential reinforcement so that when they do press that lever, you give them food. They would learn fairly quickly that pressing the lever gets them food, and you wouldn't have to go through the whole shaping procedure. Another thing that you could do is, if you're doing, especially with humans, just tell the person what you're trying to get them to do. Instead of going through this nonverbal process of shaping, maybe just ask them to do the task. And if they do it, then they get reinforcement. So you can kind of skip over shaping if there are other procedures that might be more efficient or more appropriate. Our next step is to identify the starting behavior. So with our rat, it was just being on the correct side of the cage or enclosure. What behavior is the first step towards doing our target behavior? And you have to keep in mind that that starting behavior needs to be something that this organism does already in their repertoire of behaviors. You can't have them start with a step that they don't already do. Next, you want to outline your shaping steps. What are those successive approximations that you're going to be reinforcing? Sort of what breakdowns, what steps are you going to take in between? And choose the reinforcer. What is going to be an effective technique for reinforcement? I've talked about using food as a reinforcer, but we've already kind of talked about some of the downfalls of using food. Your subject could become satiated. Maybe they've eaten too much and food is no longer rewarding. It's been devalued because of their internal state. They no longer need food or no longer want food, so food is now not a great reinforcer. It might make more sense to use something that acts as a conditioned reinforcer, something like a clicker or a token that marks when the organism has done the desired behavior, but doesn't require you to immediately give them that reinforcement. That conditioned reinforcer, I keep saying the wrong one, That conditioned reinforcer serves as sort of that positive feeling, that good feeling that comes with being reinforced without having to physically give them the actual reinforcer at that exact moment. Step 6 is to actually start doing it. Do the differential reinforcement of successful or successive approximations. Start going through the steps. For the differential reinforcement, you want to make sure that you are reinforcing the target behavior or the desired behavior in that particular step that you're on, while not reinforcing any behaviors that were previously reinforced. So anything other than what you're trying to get them to do right now, you're going to be putting the older behaviors through extinction. Because if you're trying to get that rat to press the lever, and you've already gotten past being on the right side of the cage and sniffing at the lever, and they're supposed to be touching it, you really don't want to be reinforcing them just for being on the right side of the cage. You want them to specifically be doing the targeted task at that step. Another interesting thing to note here is that if the organism happens to do one of the behaviors that's further ahead in your shaping steps. So if we were, let's go back here, if we're still at the sniffing the lever part, and in one trial the rat fully depresses the lever completely at random, you would still reinforce that behavior. You would want to give them whatever your reinforcement is at that moment, because that's the desired behavior, that's what you want. And maybe that'll end up getting them to skip a few steps, but you're always going to be looking forward, and you can reinforce ahead of where you are, but you're always going to be using extinction behind where you are. And then our last step is to keep in mind that you're moving through the shaping steps at a proper pace. So you don't want to move through them too quickly, because you want to make sure that they know that they're doing the right behavior. So again, with our rat here, if they've sniffed the lever once, you don't want to immediately then move on to you only reinforce when they touch it with their paw, because what if they haven't figured out that sniffing the lever was the behavior that got them the reinforcement in the first place? So if you move on right away, they might not be able to move forward and understand what the next step is, so you can kind of stall that way. And the same thing, you don't want to go and spend too much time on any of these steps, because if you stay and reinforce sniffing the lever for days and days and days on end, it might actually be hard to get them to stop sniffing the lever and do anything else. So when we say appropriate pace or proper pace, we mean not too fast and not too slow. You want to find that Goldilocks just right in the middle speed. And that can vary based on what techniques you're using and all sorts of things. All right, so this blank slide is actually here to tell me that this is usually where in class we'd sit down and watch a whole bunch of examples of shaping behaviors in different organisms. I've said this before, I can't show other people's YouTube videos in my own YouTube video because that's plagiarism. So this is where I'm going to tell you, pause this video or make note to go and do it afterwards. But there are a bunch of really cool videos on eClass that go over shaping in pigeons and rats and a bunch of other cool behaviors. None of them are too long, so take the time and actually go look at those, because those examples are things that you might want to know. All right. Moving on, we can talk about some tips for shaping, and some of these might have already come up, but we'll go through them all anyways. First one is that we should be reinforcing in small steps. You don't want to make large leaps forward in behavior, otherwise it might take a really long time for the organism to happen to do the behavior that you're looking for. So if we jumped straight from being on the correct side of the cage for the rat pressing a lever, all the way up to touching that lever, you might be waiting a really, really long time to actually reinforce the rat. So you want to have very small steps that you can keep them moving through at a decent pace. We also want to use continuous reinforcement. We've talked previously about like partial reinforcement, where we might have the interval or ratio types of reinforcement. Those are good if you want to prevent extinction, but continuous reinforcement means that you're learning much more quickly because you're getting that reinforcement on every single trial. So when you're trying to teach them something and you're trying to teach them something quickly, continuous reinforcement is absolutely the way to go. And in that same vein, you want to provide immediate reinforcement. So every trial gets reinforced, and every trial gets reinforced immediately. You don't want to wait around and see if they'll do anything else. You don't want to sort of pause or wait on it. As soon as they do the behavior that you're looking for, you're wanting to give them some kind of reinforcement. And like I said, you can use something like a conditioned reinforcer, something like a clicker, to immediately mark when the correct behavior has happened. And then that way they know exactly what it is that they were doing that leads to them getting whatever reinforcement they get later. And I guess I already had a point here for this. You can provide either small reinforcers, so a single piece of kibble for a dog as a treat, as opposed to giving them a bone every time they do the right thing, or a conditioned or conditional, I guess the terms are interchangeable, reinforcer, something that doesn't involve giving them a physical reinforcer at that exact moment, something like a clicker. By having smaller or conditioned reinforcers, you can prevent satiation because they're not going to get full. Food is a very common reinforcer for things like this. And also, by having it be something, especially with the conditioned reinforcers, it allows them to stay focused on the task. Like if you were giving your dog a bone or some big treat, they would take a break from doing whatever training they were doing to enjoy their snack. So it distracts them from the task at hand. I already mentioned that you can skip ahead whenever possible, so even if you have your shaping plan of steps A, then B, then C, then D, if a later behavior occurs, like if lever pressing occurred with that rat earlier on, you're going to provide that reinforcement whenever it appears. And if you have to, if you stall where for whatever reason the rat just will not touch the lever, then maybe you go back a step. Maybe you go back to when they sniff the lever. Maybe you add in extra steps to fill in some gaps if you're finding they're not moving forward. So there's going to be a little bit of play here where you can move around a little bit. And then the last point is that once you've established the desired target behavior, so once you've finished shaping, then you're going to want to move on to intermittent schedules of reinforcement. That's that ratio or interval, the partial reinforcement schedules. Because once you've done the shaping, once we've gotten our fast learning out of the way with continuous reinforcement, you want to introduce that intermittent or partial reinforcement schedule to make sure that it's going to be more resistant to extinction, to make sure that it sticks around. Now, in the textbook, we talk through a bunch of different examples of these processes. I thought it might be important to mention that, so we stress that we're using shaping to develop new behaviors that the individual isn't currently doing. Now, this can be the complete generation of novel behaviors. So getting a rat to press a lever or training a dolphin to perform tricks. That's novel behavior that fits the definition perfectly. But we can also see things that we might not think fall into that category just from the definition, but do. You can reinstate a previously exhibited behavior that the individual is no longer doing. So the textbook talks about Mrs. F, who used to walk and is now refusing to do so. And so you can use shaping to get them to do that behavior by taking baby steps. First standing, then taking a step forward while supported, then taking multiple steps, then walking with less support, and so on and so forth. So because that behavior, that walking, was no longer being exhibited by that individual, you can use shaping to get that behavior back into her repertoire. We can also use shaping to change a dimension of an existing behavior. And again, the textbook talks about an individual who was running to the bathroom multiple times an hour, and they were trying to get her to wait longer so that she didn't have to keep running to the bathroom. So they didn't have to change the behavior of going to the bathroom or not going to the bathroom. They just wanted to expand the length of time between bathroom visits. So they could use shaping to get a much longer delay between trips. And that still counts as shaping because waiting more than an hour between bathroom visits wasn't something that individual was doing before the procedure began. What else did they talk about? They talked about increasing volume of speaking voice, or getting individuals to walk with forearm crutches. Those would all fall under shaping procedures because they're getting individuals to do a behavior that they weren't previously exhibiting, or that they aren't currently exhibiting. Because I guess previous behaviors that they stopped doing can also count. But just so you don't think that it's only completely novel behaviors, we can also use them to adjust existing behaviors. All right. Next, I've already kind of been using these terms and I kind of mentioned it ahead of time, but we can talk about marking the behavior and using a clicker. Basically, our conditioned reinforcer, something that has been associated with getting a reinforcer. So usually with a clicker, let me pause for a second. So if you've never used a clicker before, the way that it usually works, especially with pet training, is that you have this clicker. It's a little device. You hold it in your hand and you can push a button and it makes a click sound. I actually have one for my birds. Not that it's gone anywhere yet, but maybe someday I'll have videos of me using one with my birds. But you click it whenever you're giving your dog a treat. And so you can associate the sound of the clicker with them getting a treat, which is why we can call it a conditioned reinforcer, because it's associated with a good thing, a reinforcing thing like food. And so the idea is that once the dog associates that clicking sound with getting food, then you don't have to give them food every single time that they do the desired thing, whatever behavior you're trying to get them to do. You could instead use the clicking to mark or indicate to that organism that they've done the correct behavior and that they will be getting reinforcement in the near future, but you're letting them know the exact moment in time that they've done the correct behavior, and you're letting them know that they can expect reinforcement shortly. And so these clickers let you do that immediate reinforcement without disrupting the whole learning environment, without getting them to stop to eat or do something else. And you're also preventing accidentally reinforcing other behaviors by waiting before giving them that reinforcement. So by having the clicker go off as soon as they do the right behavior, there's no confusion in their mind what behavior was the right behavior. Now, the next section is all about shaping problem behaviors, and this was a really interesting read. Even if you're not a huge fan of reading the textbook, this is a really cool section where it talks about how we very often unintentionally end up shaping and reinforcing bad or undesirable behaviors. And we've actually seen an example of this in our first assignment, where we had Victoria at the grocery store who would throw a temper tantrum any time that she didn't get a toy, I think. And so her parents would give her a toy to stop her from throwing a temper tantrum. So in Victoria's mind, she's getting this reinforcement for crying. Whenever she cries, she gets a toy. So she's going to cry more and more often. But from the parent's perspective, they're giving that toy to get her to stop crying. They're getting that behavior to stop. But what they don't realize is that the way that they're trying to stop that behavior is actually going to make her cry more in the long term. So there's lots of examples in the textbook, but this comic here sums it up fairly well. So we have a mom at the grocery store with her kids, and one of the kids keeps nagging at the mother to get her to buy them treats. Get me a treat, Mom, I want a treat, Mom, please, this, that, I want this, I want that. So she keeps saying no. She says no all through the grocery store. No, 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 no. And then at the very end, she finally gives in and is like, oh my gosh, if it gets you to stop asking, fine, you can have a treat. But if we think of this in terms of shaping, then what behavior has been reinforced for this child? The expectation that if you ask enough times, your mother will eventually say yes. So it's encouraging them to keep asking, to ask over and over and over again until the mother says yes. So even though at the beginning the mother thinks that saying no, that's the right thing, I'm doing the right thing, which theoretically they are, when they finally say yes at the end, they're kind of going in the opposite direction from what they're intending to do. And so there's a lot of examples of this, childhood tantrums or other types of problem behaviors. A lot of times they'll be doing them to get attention. So the first time that a child starts crying and their parents come over, they're getting attention. That's a reinforcing behavior. So that means that the child's going to be more likely to cry in the future. And so even if the parents are deciding, okay, well, we're going to make them, like, we're going to try and do our best to get them to stop crying, we're going to ignore them. But if they cry harder, maybe the parents get concerned and go and check on them, and they reinforce that crying harder behavior. In the textbook, they talk of a kid whose crying wasn't working, so they started throwing their toys. And so the parents went in and dealt with that. But that's just reinforcing throwing their toys and crying. So by going in and interacting with them, by giving them that attention, you're shaping that behavior and you're developing problem behavior, even though in a lot of the parents' minds, the initial plan was to make that behavior decrease, and it ends up going in the opposite direction. So this would be an unknowing employment of differential reinforcement of successive approximations. And some other examples other than just children throwing tantrums, you can have your parents yelling or nagging, where they ask you to clean your room, and so maybe you do it. Maybe it takes them asking you twice. But then the next time you're like, I'll do it later, and you ignore them a little bit, and you only respond when they get angry about it. And then you get so used to them being angry about it that it doesn't bother you anymore, so then they have to start screaming and yelling. And you have then, again, unknowingly used differential reinforcement of successive approximations to encourage yelling behavior from parents. Showing off or telling stories. Maybe the first time you get a laugh out of a fairly simple story, but over time they've heard that story. They need something newer and exciting and more intense to get the same kind of reaction. So you would tell more and more elaborate stories or do more and more crazy showing off type behaviors. Things like, skateboard tricks or something like that. Maybe people stop being impressed that you can stand on a skateboard, so now you want to stand on a skateboard and then jump. Maybe you want to do more complex tricks each time to get that same level of attention. So again, shaping that behavior. Or even something as simple as your dog begging for food, where if you ignore them, but then you give in, you're shaping that more intense begging behavior. And that works on birds too, I can tell you. All right, our next category is actually a really, really cool one, and there's a video for this up on eClass just because it's so fun, but this is superstitious behavior, and it's in quotes because there's some debate as to whether or not this is a real thing, but this is basically the idea that behavior that is going to occur even though it doesn't seem to produce the consequence. And this is tied to a very specific example. I think the one that started this all off with was pigeons. And so if you think of, say, like our auto-shaping behaviors earlier on, where a light would turn on, and then after a certain amount of time, the pigeons would get food. So the light has nothing to do with the pigeons getting food, it's just letting them know that it's coming. Well, if you have pigeons in a box, and at some point they're going to get food, they might start associating whatever behavior they're doing in the box before they get food with getting that food. And if we use this lens of shaping, then whatever behavior they were doing that they think has led to them getting food, they're going to do that behavior more and more often. So there was an original study that reported these so-called superstitious behaviors in pigeons, where they had pigeons who would turn in circles because maybe they had been in the process of turning the first time they got food, and they felt that that was reinforcement for that turning behavior, and before too long the pigeon would just sit and spin in circles. Or pecking a certain spot or doing a certain thing. So these behaviors end up being reinforced, and because they're doing them more, they will be doing that behavior when the food is dispersed again later, even if the food is unrelated to the behavior, it just sort of coincides, which makes them do it more, which makes it more likely that they're doing that behavior when the food shows up again later, and so on and so forth. So they can kind of shape themselves without it actually being shaping. So this superstitious behavior is its own unique category. And again, very cool video on it. And I'm sure you could find some others because it's very fun. I will say, just as an aside, the part that isn't too solid on this is that later research has found it really hard to duplicate these results, where the spontaneous occurrence of superstitious behavior doesn't seem to be as common as it was originally proposed to be, but that's sort of its own can of worms. So we'll leave it at that. So let's wrap up this chapter by talking about a type of shaping that everyone is going to experience or has at this point experienced in their lives. And this is the acquisition of language. Whether it be verbal, written, or signed, everyone goes through a whole bunch of different stages of shaping to acquire language. So let's look at the acquisition of verbal behavior. So a child learning to speak. When they're very young, they're going to do a behavior called babbling. Those syllables and sounds are going to be pretty much random at first. They just babble. But as time goes on, they will happen to make sounds that sound familiar or that kind of resemble some of the words that we use in everyday life. So maybe we're going to hear da or ma in their babbling. And so parents are going to respond positively to that. They're going to give the child attention and encouragement when they hear those sounds. Then they're going to encourage sounds that occur together, things like dada and mama. So you can see the shaping occurring here. And the same way we've talked about shaping rats' behavior to press a lever, with these sounds, as we move from babbling into sort of individual syllables, the parents don't necessarily respond as positively to the babbling because now they're focusing in on those individual syllables. And once they start putting those syllables together into primitive words, they're going to stop reinforcing those early syllables and focus on reinforcing the words. And of course, these words and syllables are going to end up occurring more often because of the attention that they're getting, because of that reinforcement. So we get closer and closer approximations to those words. And then we can start shaping when those words are appropriate. So you could get an even closer approximation for reinforcing words that are in the right context. So if the child says dada when their father is in the room, they're going to be reinforced. But if they're not there, then it's less important. If they say ball when they have a ball in their hand, that's going to get them a lot more reinforcement. And so because of this, they're going to learn to say the correct words in the correct scenario. And we can frame this using our three-term contingency. So if we look at our diagram over here, we can have our speaker and our listener and sort of the different stages as we go back and forth between the two. So we start with our speaker, the child, and our discriminative stimulus here is that the salt is out on the table, but it's not in their reach. So the response in that particular situation would be to say, please pass the salt. And this is obviously when they've passed beyond babbling and single words to saying sentences. We could simplify this and have the child just say salt. I don't know how many very young children know that they want salt on their food, though. So again, take the example, I guess, with a grain of salt. But so the response is to say, please pass the salt when the salt is out, but they can't reach it. On the listener's side of things, being asked to pass the salt is itself a discriminative stimulus for the listener. So when they hear that, they can choose to make the response, because of that discriminative stimulus, that they're going to pass the salt. And so as a result, when they get the salt, that would serve as a reinforcing stimulus. That's what the SR is. I'm not sure if we've seen that denotion yet, but it just means that they got the thing that they wanted. They were reinforced because they got what they wanted from what they asked for. And then getting this can be a new discriminative stimulus because somebody did something for you, somebody did as they were asked, which triggers a new response where you say thank you. And being thanked serves as a reinforcing stimulus for the listener because the child thanked them for doing this behavior here. So we have a couple of different sets of 3-term contingencies, where for the speaker we have that discriminative stimulus of the salt is out but they can't reach it, so they ask for the salt as their response. And the reinforcing stimulus is when they get the salt. That's our first situation there. The second would be to look at our listener who, upon hearing them ask for salt, passes the salt, and then is thanked for their troubles. And then we can look at sort of another partial one up here, where when they get that salt, they should then say thank you. And I guess we could keep on going from there for the whole interaction. But it just shows how we can break these down and see how these different behaviors can be reinforcing on both sides. And this last slide is still looking at verbal behavior. This isn't an experiment from the textbook, but it does illustrate that idea that sort of consistent, continuous reinforcement is better for acquiring new skills. So this was an experiment that was looking at how individuals responded to differing levels of reinforcement. The specifics don't matter too much, but what we care about is that in this procedure they had 4 different confederates, basically 4 people who were actually experimenters, but the participants didn't know that they were part or in on the experiment. But those confederates would deliver differing rates of verbal reinforcers to a subject. So some would give continuous reinforcement, so every single trial would be reinforced. Some would give sort of more spread out reinforcement. So we'd look at, actually at the bottom here, we can see percent of reinforcement. So we go from 0, so no reinforcement. 1% would be 1 out of 10, or this 0.1. So it would be 10%, so 1 out of every 10 trials would get reinforced, all the way up to 100%, which would be that every single trial gets reinforced. And the results are that the rate of responding, so how strongly those subjects responded to the reinforcement, was exactly predicted by the matching law, which basically says that your rate of responding is going to be equivalent to the rate of reinforcement available. I don't care about the specifics of the terms that are here. I just care about the fact that as you are reinforced more and more consistently, you're also going to respond more and more consistently. So it's actually a 1-to-1 ratio. That's what the equation is telling us. But that's less important. I just want you to know that as you get more and more consistent reinforcement, you're going to see more and more consistent responding. And there's a relationship between those two. And I will leave it there for this chapter.